Today, we have with us Professor Nicholas Halmi. He's Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Oxford, and he's a Margaret Candfield Fellow of University College. So from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in various topics, with a few being Enlightenment and Romantic literature, philosophy, and comparative literature. So I know a lot of graduate students find it difficult sometimes to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think of that process of choosing what or who to study. How do you approach that process of pinning down what or who resonates with you, and what led you to your own research?
Um, I can't presume to offer advice on choosing subjects, because that's obviously very personal. But I can say that in some ways, the fact that I work on Enlightenment and Romantic literature is something of an accident, and it's a result of a process that began when I was an undergraduate, and my interest, expanded and moved, as it were, backwards chronologically. So as an undergraduate, I was focused quite a bit on modernist literature. And I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on the poet W.B. Yeats. And and I was particularly interested in his concept of the symbol. And as I began to read about this, it took me back to romantic concepts of the symbol and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in particular. And so when I was a graduate student, then I began to write about this, and I wound up writing my PhD thesis on Coleridge and the concept of the symbol. And then that in a turn generated other interests. And so I became a romanticist, as it were, by accident, and not out of some interest in the period as such, but in an interest in particular concepts and ideas and intellectual movements. And now, given the configuration of the profession, I have to define myself in certain chronological ways, but my research interests have never been confined in that way. And there was always a tension. This was already true when I was writing my PhD thesis, between my intellectual interests and the sort of demands of the profession, and the necessity of confining oneself, or defining, not confining, but defining oneself chronologically. One thing I will say, though, an observation that I've made over the years of teaching graduate students, now over 20 years, indeed over 25 years, is that I've noticed a kind of narrowing of focus. And many graduate students work on topics that they wrote their undergraduate dissertations on, and then they write their master's dissertations on the same. So it's a kind of development of something that they'd already been working on as undergraduates. And of course, to extent that's true with me, but there was a considerable expansion, and I didn't wind up working on modernism. I wound up working on the earlier periods, and so on. But I find now that graduate students sometimes are reluctant to work outside a comfort zone that they developed as undergraduates. And I think that does them a kind of intellectual disservice, but it also makes them less well prepared for teaching, because you're teaching, the demands of teaching never really correspond to the limits of your research interests. And it also produces certain problems when you're trying to contextualize whatever author or particular topic you're working on. And I find that there's a tendency to rely on certain theoretical or historical authority figures, to say, as X says, for the context. So citing Michel Foucault, let us say, and his definition of the distinction between the classical and the modern epistemes, as if what Foucault wrote was gospel truth and therefore can be taken as given and just applied. And in fact, and you see this say with Habermas in the public sphere, or other figures like that, who are actually much contested, and the historical arguments are sometimes quite dubious. But because they're established historical figures, and because the students tend to work on a very specific area and then rely on other figures for the context, then they're not able to engage more fully with those kinds of debates. So I think it's a distressing
No, yeah.
tendency I've seen in the last, couple decades.
Yeah, definitely. So kind of find your niche, but also branch out at the same time almost.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So in your own Oxford profile, you write, quote, the modern meaning of the word literature, literary work or production, dates only from the end of the 18th century, unquote. And you explain that this time, which is ultimately a time of modernity and progress, is at the center of your research and teaching. So, can you tell us a little bit about, for those who don't know, what was happening during the end of the 18th century to aptly understand its significance and to help us pinpoint some of the key themes and characteristics of the literature coming out of it and like why it was so important?
Yeah, that's on my college website, which hasn't been updated in a long time. And I would now phrase it somewhat differently. So I'll answer
Okay.
your question, but I'll also then want to contest
Yeah.
what I wrote myself. And obviously that's looking at the 18th century, the later 18th century from the perspective of today and trying to identify commonalities or continuities. And these are things I do discuss with my students, in fact. And so what I had in mind when I wrote that was certain aspects of, for example, a commodity consumerist culture. You can see is establishing itself in the latter half of the 18th century. In Britain, with the Copyright of 1774, which gives authors more control over copyright, you have the emergence of a modern, or what we now call modern, literary marketplace. And hence, that makes it possible for people to make a living from their writing, so long, of course, as they appeal to the public, or the reading public. Um, and so you have a shift from an older system of aristocratic patronage to one of to a marketplace. And related concepts of intellectual property, of beginnings of industrialization and improved printing methods, including stereotyping, which enables reprinting of works more efficiently,
Mm.
and so on. You have beginnings of artistic celebrity culture, with Goethe, for example, in the publication of The Sorrows of Young Werther in 1774, which makes him a celebrity and also involves kinds of commodification of the novels. So the figure, the porcelain figurines of characters in the novel.
Mm.
It generates a fashion trend, so that Werner's costume of tan trousers and blue jackets becomes a fashion trend that's followed by others, and that kind of thing. And then you see that in Britain with Byron as well, that kind of something that we would recognize now as celebrity culture. Increasing emphasis on originality of
Mm.
composition as opposed to adherence to traditional models and so on. And in a more general engagement with bourgeois life, representations of bourgeois life, which you wouldn't have found, say, in the 16th century, say, or 17th century. So those are the kinds of things I had in mind when I said that. What I'm working on now, though, is questioning in that, because when one speaks of modernity in that way, it's always defining a break from the past or beginnings. And when one speaks of beginning, one tends to look at events, say here's an
Mm.
event that inaugurates the new thing that leads to where we are today. And so one tends to fixate on particular events. French Revolution would be, an obvious example of that. And it was for people at the time. They responded to the French Revolution as if this were something completely unprecedented and a new era in world history had begun. But another way of looking at that is saying these things that are happening in the 18th century are not merely beginnings of a reality we know today, but they're also the culmination of other processes that had begun earlier. And so what I'm increasingly looking at now are those processes. I mean, one of the things that also begins in the 18th century is a modern concept of history, or so-called modern concept of history, as linear, unidirectional, and as opposed to cyclical, say. And the idea that the ideas of cultural specificity and individuality. So things aren't repeated, but also we have to judge individual cultures and times by criteria that are appropriate to them and not by transhistorical standards. And that idea in itself encourages a tendency to segment history into periods, and to look for events that we say will inaugurate the French Revolution, or Martin Luther's nailing the theses to the door, which may of Wittenberg Cathedral, which may never have happened, in fact, or these kinds of things. So we have this fixation on individual events and periods. We segment history, and I'm increasingly questioning now that whole narrative that says, well, the 18th century is the real beginning of modernity, because the 18th century didn't happen in a vacuum, and these events themselves had things. So I'm looking at these what led up to the things that we now identify with modernity, and I'm thinking increasingly of periods, which I'm not saying we can get rid of. I mean, you need to, history is too long to be, you can't deal with the whole thing. So you need to find ways of dividing it to make it manageable. But I'm increasingly thinking of periods not as segments of time with abrupt beginnings and endings, but as processes.
Interesting. And where would you say that the beginning of modernity lies then? Is it kind of in 17th century coffeehouse culture and like the rise of the novel, or where do you see those forming?
It depends on the context in which you're defining modernity, for example. So the present, I'm working on aesthetics and theorization of art, because I think some of the issues of what we call historicism, this modern concept of linear time, and which also implies the possibility of temporal disruption, breaks in time, or a possibility of emancipating oneself from the past. These ideas in aesthetics, in artistic history, are found much earlier, going back to the 15th, 16th centuries, 17th centuries.
Wow.
And with Renaissance artists defining themselves in opposition to what they begin to call the Middle Ages and so on. And so I'm interested in that, a series of steps, in other words, that leads up to 18th century, when things become more modern in a sense that we would recognize now.
Interesting. Yeah. And how does that feature in the literature coming out of the 18th century? Like all these political and social things happening, what impact does that have on literature? How is literature then characterized?
Well, there are a number of things that occur, and one of them is the increasing self-reflexivity, increasing reflection on literary production. In the earlier centuries, there was a preoccupation with literary works, but they weren't conceived as literature. So they were conceived as in poetry, or different kinds of poetry, drama, epic, lyric, and so on. And these had their own rules, they had their own decorum, but they were governed primarily by conceptions derived from ancient rhetoric, and the idea that you need to do certain things within certain rules in order to achieve certain effects. And what happens is the contestation there between these classical rules and the recognition of new forms, and the difficulty of applying some of these classical rules to vernacular languages and particular forms in vernacular languages. So it generates literary criticism as we know it, really in the 16th century.
Yes.
And then that in turn then creates the possibility of reflecting about literature more broadly. So a concept of literature as opposed to distinct genres develops really that does develop in the 18th century, and not only in English, but in French. And not the term, but the concept is clearly emergent in Germany too in the 18th century. And it's really a notion of a body of work that is intended primarily to provoke an aesthetic response as opposed to convey moral truths.
Right. So
And
yeah.
so early, I mean, the word literature is used in English earlier, but it means learning, erudition,
Mm.
scholarship. And Samuel Johnson in the mid 18th century is an interesting figure because he uses it in that sense when he speaks of Milton's literature. He means his learning,
Mm.
his knowledge of languages and his knowledge of classical writing and so on. But he also uses it in the modern sense of someone who produces writing that people admire as beautiful when he speaks of Abraham Cowley in that sense. So you
Mm.
find both of these senses at the same time. And then by the later 18th century, the idea of literature as a body of writing that's intended to provoke an aesthetic response. You find in Voltaire, for example, and others as well as
Yeah.
in
Yeah, I think the shift from the kind of classical philosophical way of thinking about literature as like didactic and meant to kind of instruct or provide moral insight or ethical insight, the shift from that characterization to what we know as fiction today is really, really interesting. And it's interesting to kind of pull out where exactly that started, because it's such a massive shift. And I think many people don't even know that that's what literature.
Yeah, well, I'd say it doesn't exactly start anywhere. That's the
Well,
point.
yeah,
It's a process, and in a sense that the emergence of the new concept of literature is a culmination of and a kind of
yeah,
interrogation that had been going on for a couple centuries. And you find it also um, not just in literature, but in visual arts, a questioning of hierarchies of subject matter, and in architecture, there's a furious debate about different kinds of styles of architecture. I mean, so all of these disciplines are becoming much more self-conscious um,
mm,
in a way.
yeah. I would also love to speak a little bit about the notion of romanticism or romanticisms. And you kind of touched on this when you were breaking down our perception of periods. And this is the romantic period, and that's it. It just exists here, kind of in a vacuum, potentially. But you write a brilliant article for Modern Language Quarterly entitled Romanticism, the Temporalization of History and the Historization of Form, in which you say that one critic's romanticism may have something in common with another's, and the second critic's romanticism may have something else in common with the third critic's, but there is nothing necessarily in common among all the critics' romanticisms apart from the label. So, what does this notion of a romanticism mean to you? And do you see it as, I think I already know the answer to this, but do you see it as a static temporal moment that we look back on as like, oh, it existed here, informed by the time and place of these individuals and their minds? Or is it something that exists in a much more fluid sense, maybe even continuing into the present?
Um, it, I should say at the outset that I am hardly the first one to point out that,
No.
there's this multiplicity of concepts. And in 1924, A.L. Lovejoy, the historian of ideas, the American historian of ideas, published an article that subsequently became famous, saying, there is no such thing as romanticism. We can only speak of romanticisms, plural.
Hmm.
But even to speak of it in the plural assumes that there's something there that can be spoken of at all if we're going to retain this term. So, um, and one of the difficulties is that from the beginning of the use of the term, which was already in the 19th century, not my British writers of the early 19th century didn't call themselves romantic. So that's a later 19th century sort of projection backwards. Um, But in France and Germany and elsewhere, they were using this term. And already from the beginning of the use of the term, it has been problematic because it was used in two distinct ways. One was as a chronological marker, and the other was as a kind of typological characteristic that can be applied to writers of any time. So, and this tension between these two distinct senses, one universal and one historically specific, has persisted to the present. So I'd say the problem, Romanticism can't be solved because the tension is there inherent in the term and the concept from the beginning.
Yeah.
And it reflects, I think, a difficulty of a kind of self-periodizing that wants to assert something distinctive, but also lays claim to earlier things from the past. Romance, after all, referring to chivalric literature and the Middle Ages and this kind of revaluation of the Middle Ages. And so there is this tension there, and I don't think that can be resolved. But on the other hand, I'm not suggesting that we abandon the term, although this has been repeatedly suggested almost as long as the term has been used, and somehow we're never able to get rid of it. So, and so there's a practical sense in which you can refer to literature, it's easier to refer to literature of let's say 1780 to 1830 in the British context as romantic, rather than to give it dates or something like that. And so I certainly use the term in that very convenient way. And that's, what I have to teach. I teach literature at Oxford. The so-called romantic paper would be 1760 to 1830. So, and in different nations have different romanticisms too, as far as periodization is concerned. So in France, it would be a little later. In Germany, it would be roughly the same as in Britain, and so on. But there is that chronological use which is a very straightforward one and doesn't imply necessarily that all of these things under that rubric have much in common with each other. And one critic, a German critic, Christoph Bode, has argued that the way to think of Romanticism is not to try to identify commonalities among all the things we call romantics, but to see that, and he assumes that, we can speak of a relatively stable, at least beginning chronological period for Romanticism, but to assume that they're responding to common problems in diverse ways. And the diversity is part of the point.
Right.
And I think
so there's not a formula. There's not one formula. This makes a romantic poet. Here it is.
Yeah, and that would be my argument. And when people try to do so, they get themselves into trouble. The very distinguished Yale critic René Velick argued against Lovejoy that there is a kind of normative essence of Romanticism, and he defined it in terms of myth and symbol and interest in nature and so on. And that meant that he had to exclude Lord Byron from that, because Byron was ironic and wasn't interested in the same things that Wordsworth in England and Novalis in Germany and so on were interested in. Even though Byron's contemporaries considered him the epitome of a romantic poet. So you have the paradox of a romantic period that excludes someone who his contemporaries thought was a romantic, but René Velick says, no, he's not a romantic. So if you don't assume that there's an essence of Romanticism, you don't get yourself into those kinds of problems.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's really interesting that in modern society, I think we have this obsession with categorization somewhat. Like I remember, this is very, very different, but I remember when Nirvana was being classified as a grunge band, they were like, we're not grunge. What is grunge? I don't know what grunge is, And so there's that idea of this new genre of grunge, it's emerging and you're in it. And they're like, I don't know what that is. I'm not in it. Or even the beat poets. I know a lot of them did not resonate with the word beat or beats and did not want and completely rejected the label. And so I think it's really interesting when the subject of the label itself is rejecting it and is combating it. I find that really, really strange and interesting. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and in the Romantic period, so called, uh, you find something exactly comparable. Byron himself wrote to Goethe. He dedicated one of his plays to Goethe, and he said, there's been much discussion of this distinction between Romantic and Classical, but I don't recognize that distinction. And he's be horrified if such a thing existed. So
Yeah.
he certainly didn't want to define himself in those terms. And others, other writers at the time were more concerned with distinguishing themselves from their contemporary writers than with any classification of that kind. So,
Right. Why do you think we have a obsession or a need to categorize people into nice little historical pots or groups?
well, I mean, that this is possible as a result of a kind of what I would call a kind of modernity, which is basically self-reflection on history and the idea that history has beginning points and history consists in discontinuities as well as continuities, because you can't have periodization without a concept of discontinuity. Um,
Mm.
and it makes framing possible, um, in ways that suggest history is manageable in some way. But it can, certainly it's true that certain writers would and artists would resist classification of that sort. um, but it also serves as a kind of reference point for people when they want to dissociate themselves from what preceded them, for example.
Definitely. Yeah. So it's almost like a kind of subjective identifier that you can either choose this label and take it on yourself or reject it in order to differentiate yourself or
Well, I'd say not subjective, but intersubjective.
yes. Yes, exactly.
The the problem becomes when you claim that they have objective status.
Yes.
What's important to realize is these things, they may be useful, they may be indispensable, in fact, because you can't treat a continuum. That's simply
Mm.
it's too overwhelming. Um, but you also have to recognize that these are constructions, these are
Mm.
idealizations, and so um, and they they do have some empirical foundation, no doubt, because people do have common concerns at particular times in response to particular situations. So it's not
Yes.
as if the French Revolution wasn't a major event with worldwide implications. It's just that the way this was framed as an unprecedented event, that had changed human history, um, has is easily accepted, if one already has this assumption that such a break is possible in the first place. And
Definitely.
the difficulty is then that if you take that as given, and it prevents you then from questioning, well, what relation did the French Revolution have to things before it? And what also didn't change, because in fact a lot did not change, or in fact a lot regressed after Napoleon. So
No, definitely. I would also love to speak a little bit about this word modernity,
yeah.
which has always really irked me as a student. I feel like I've never quite grasped what exactly this is the definition, this is what it means, like end of kind of a thing. And so you explain also in your bio, which is maybe a little not updated, but I still think it's really interesting, that you're interested in, quote, the challenges and discontents of modernity in the relation to the historical past. And so I would love to speak a little bit about this word, which I think is really elusive and slippery. And I'm not really sure why. Perhaps because it tends to be applied to so many different moments in history. And each time it gets a little bit more and more muddied. But can you help us to define this elusive, slippery word and pinpoint why it's so significant in the end of the 18th century and its literature?
Yeah. I can't give you definition of it, but I
Define it
can
now.
only give you how I conceive it. And the way I conceive it is not as a particular set of qualities, because that gets you into the same problem as defining Romanticism. But what is noticeable is that you find not just in the 18th century, but already in the 17th century, to an extent earlier, but it becomes more pervasive in the late 17th century onwards, is a tendency to define oneself in terms of a discontinuity from the past, or an assumption that one is now living in a distinct period that somehow differs from everything that had preceded before it. So it presumes a kind of, so it's, in other words, I'm defining modernity then as a self-conception of modernity, a self-assertion of modernity
Right.
as a break from the past in some way, a radical break from the past, rather than in a series of substantive things, this change, that change. So it's really about self-conception. And what interests me about that is that, of course, this kind of assertion presupposes that such a radical break is possible, and it also excludes any kinds of connections to what has immediately preceded it, which is presumably what prompted this desire for a break in
Right.
the first place. And so, and the discontents are the recognition that if you're asserting a radical discontinuity in the past, that also involves loss. It involves a loss of a sense of tradition, loss of a sense of continuity, loss of supposedly universal or at least trans-historical standards and that kind of thing, criteria. And then the question is, how do you recuperate what got left behind? So those are the kinds of tensions and discontents I mean, when I speak of modernity,
Definitely.
rather than as a specific series of qualities. I mean, one can always say, well, certain things happen that continue to the present, as my old website said with respect to the 18th century. And so that constitutes modernity,
Right.
modernity as what we identify as the beginnings of the state in which we're still living. But how I would define it now is really the self-assertion of modernity in ways that you don't find in earlier centuries and millennia, as a desire to break from the past.
Yes. And I think so it's almost like we're looking at the symbol of modernity rather than what is being signified as this is it, here it is. It's more the symbol.
It's the self-assertion, the self-conception of modernity. Yeah, that for me constitutes modernity, as it were.
Yes. Yes. I think that very well leads us into the genealogy of the romantic symbol, which is an amazing book that I find really interesting. And I would love to hear a little bit about your thoughts on it and some of the ideas that we were discussing in it. And yeah, so you characterize the symbol of the romantic period, the symbol, as a theoretical construct. And this symbol is used, as you say, quote, not to describe objects of perception, but to condition the perception of objects. And you write that this is, quote, the point of contact between the contingent and the absolute, the finite and the infinite, the individual and the universal. But it is also meant to refer to, quote, nothing but itself, so that image and idea were inherently and inseparably connected in it. So I think it's a very complicated idea to kind of wrap your head around. But I think if you can wrap your head around it, it's very, very clear and it's really interesting. And so I think this quote sums it up very well, that this symbol is supposed to be at once infinitely meaningful and capable of being reduced to any particular meaning. And so because of that, the symbol remains, in my words, I would say, infinitely accessible, but also inaccessible, like very, very inaccessible. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about this romantic symbol and why it's specifically a product of the late 18th century, if it is, or its ties to the temporal moment, and what transformations we see in the usage and thinking about symbols in this period, say from someone like Ferdinand de Saussure's theory of signs and earlier kind of thinking about symbols. Even someone like Lacan, who is later, I think he does a lot of work with symbols, and I studied a lot of Lacan, and so it was very, very convoluted. And so I think your idea of your thinking about the romantic symbol is really interesting, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
So what I call the romantic concept of the symbol, others have said is really a concept of the romantic symbol, and I think that's a fair criticism. So
Okay.
I group a number of writers on this subject of the late 18th, early 19th centuries: Goethe, Friedrich Schelling, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, preeminently, and a few others, and I construct a kind of model of what I call the romantic symbol. But now I'm happy to say, yes, it's a romantic symbol. And there are others, or there are other things called the symbol in the period, and that's fine. And the concept, I think, develops out of a dissatisfaction with some of the problems of dualism. Dualism in semiotics, the idea of a distinction between the signifier and the signified, and dualism between the mind, the self, and object, subject, and object, dualism between man and nature, and so on. And the concept of the symbol is an attempt to theorize some way that resolves these dualisms into a monism. And so it differs very, you mentioned Saussure's conception of language. Well, his concept of language is that language is structured by differences, so that the reason that bat means one thing and cat means something has nothing to do with any inherent relation to the things they refer to. It has to do with the structure of differences in the language itself. So the distinction between those consonants then ensures that they mean one thing and not another. So it's a system of signs that's entirely structured by differences, and its possibility of meaningfulness is determined by those differences rather than by any inherent connection to anything else, to anything external. And what I called the romantic concept of the symbol is reaction against idea of arbitrary signification. And it's also reflects a kind of anxiety about interpretation, that arbitrary signification, which is to say linguistic signification, preeminently entails. And so and the reason I say, and this has been controversial in my book, when I say that the symbol, the romantic symbol, never existed. It was a figment of theory. It was a pure theoretical creation. And I tend to have, well, I was responding to Paul de Man, and on the other hand, to various theological critics, especially of Coleridge, who wanted to say, yes, the symbol is a real thing. And de Man assumed that the symbol is a kind of mystified description of a form of representation that recognizes its own arbitrariness. And he calls that allegory. I mean, I think his conception of allegory is far too simplistic, but that's another story. But for me, when people begin theorizing about something, that in itself is indicative that it can't be taken for granted. So I think if the people were able to perceive symbols of the kind that they described in the theory, they wouldn't have needed to theorize it. And that's why I argue what they're describing is not a thing, an actual phenomenon. It's they're articulating a desire for a phenomenon, and the theory then enables that, or is intended to enable that to happen. So what they really want to do is reform perception of reality.
Mm,
And that's why the writers I look at are conceive the symbol not as a literary phenomenon, but one of much broader terms of nature in particular.
mm,
So Goethe pointed to a fig tree and said, it's a symbol. It's a symbol, and by symbolizing itself, symbolizes everything else. So it's inherently meaningful and is grounded in nature. Um, but it's also um, if a symbol can symbolize everything else, and in a sense, it also symbolizes nothing, and it can't be
exactly.
interpreted. So it can't be reduced to any individual meaning, which means that it's infinitely meaningful, but
Yes.
not has no particular meaning, which means that it
Yeah.
resists interpretation, and
Yes.
therefore, well, you could say obfuscates, obviates the problems of interpretation. But
Yeah.
that idea of the inherence of it, and Coleridge too referred to nature as a structure of symbols, which to him revealed the divine intelligence. But the fact that we can recognize them shows, in turn, an inherent connection between us and that divine intelligence and nature, in other words. Um,
Yes.
But since we couldn't actually perceive them, we needed the theory to tell us that. And that's what made me suspicious of it. And so,
No,
well,
definitely. I think it actually is very, very clear. Like I think it's almost like the symbol is significant because of the fact that it signifies, if that makes sense. It doesn't signify anything inherent, but it signifies it's I don't know how to explain it. It's like it's infinitely meaningful because of the very fact that it signifies something, but you can't be like, there it is. Is that like an accurate way of thinking about it? Like the fact that it does function as a symbol is what gives it significance.
well, there's a kind of inherent contradiction in that because a symbol, when you use that term, you think, well, a symbol is a symbol of something.
Right.
But in the Romantic conception of it isn't a symbol of something, it is pure meaningfulness.
Right.
And for me, the question then is not because that's not a coherent definition of the symbol. The interest to me was what is this symptomatic of rather than what is this a symbol of, what is the articulation of this concept symptomatic of? What is the desire behind it, the intellectual desire? And the intellectual desire to me was a desire to overcome dualism, to postulate some kind of representational system that isn't arbitrary and unites subject and object, man and nature, and so on. In other words,
Yes.
um, overcomes the legacies of dualism, of mechanistic philosophy, and Enlightenment semiotics, which emphasizes the distinction between signifier and signified, and so on. And so I
Yes.
see it as a kind of intellectual fantasy. And that's what earlier critics hadn't identified in it. And that's how I see it. But as I say, it's a controversial argument because some people have a real commitment to this idea of the symbol being real.
Yes, it really reminds me. So my third year dissertation was very Lacanian, and it really reminds me of. I think some of his ideas are genuinely very wacky, but some are very fun to kind of dissect and deal with, especially in accordance with texts. And this kind of reminds me of his theory of the triangulation of desire and how, for example, you never actually want a thing, but you want a third thing that that thing signifies for yourself. Like, for example, you don't want an iPhone, but you want the approval of everyone in society to think that you have money and that you're wealthy and that you are up with the times. And so you buy that. So you want the iPhone, but the iPhone really functions as a symbol of infinite meaningfulness as to your true desire, which can truly never be satisfied. You'll never reach your true desire. So this kind of reminds me of this idea of they are trying to grasp at something, and they're using these third things to do that, but they're not actually gesturing towards this third thing, but rather to something else, infinite.
Well, because if you were to specify what the symbol is or what it means, it would deflate.
Right.
It would be reduced then to a single meaning, and it would become indistinguishable from any other kind of trope, say. Um,
Yes.
so it's its potential lies precisely in its inexhaustibility, in its infinite meaningfulness, and its irreducibility to any particular meaning.
Definitely. And why did they push back so heavily against these dualisms? What was that motivated by?
I think there was a sense that they had that these had exhausted themselves, and there's a sense of alienation in various
Mm,
ways. Um, you see this in the aesthetics of the sublime, for example, um, which the mind discovers its power at the cost as at the cost of its own feeling of terror or feeling of belittlement in the face of something overwhelming. So there's a kind of exaltation of the mind, but it's also at the expense of something external. And so there's no way of reconciling those two. And so the symbol is one way of responding to the um, to an aesthetics of the sublime in which the self can never feel at home with itself because it's always defining itself, it's always exalting itself in relation to something external to it. Um, and
mm,
similarly with semiotics, you always have the problem of an endless referentiality. The problem is to interpret the relationship between signifier and signifier, you have to appeal to the third term
right,
interpretations. You have this kind of endless regress, and you're never in the presence of full meaning. Um,
right.
and the idea of the symbol was that it's inherent and not merely created humanly. So it enacts or it manifests a connection in which humans feel reintegrated in a world from which mechanical philosophy or materialism would make them feel excluded in some way or alienated.
And alienated. Yeah.
And
Interesting.
at the same time, it counters a charge of arbitrariness, and it counters the problem of an infinite regress of signification through a process of interpretation.
You see,
Um,
that's what I sometimes struggle with. I sometimes feel that these symbols are just infinitely signifying to other symbols and that we're never actually touching on the core meaning, as it were, if there is one. Do you know what I mean?
yeah, and because there can't be any meaning, um, and and you can see that in other contexts too. I mean, the philosopher Hans Blumenberg once said of Heidegger's concept of Sein, of being, that of course he can never reveal what the meaning of being is, because if he were, it would be so banal that it would scarcely be worth talking about. So it's the fact that that meaning is never fully disclosed what makes it significant.
It's so true. Yeah. Um, Heidegger, I think, is really interesting. He's my mother's favorite philosopher. And so I've heard a lot about him, but I find him very difficult to read, like incredibly difficult. um, yeah, I think the whole idea of using language to depict something inaccessible or in kind of not reachable is a common struggle that I also find when I'm writing. But I think it's really interesting the fact that language is our only tool, but there are also some things that should not be and cannot be depicted with language. I find that really interesting.
Yeah.
Um,
For me, what was interesting with the concept of the symbol was that it is supposed to be non-discursive, and yet it requires a large discourse to inform us of the fact of its existence. And that's, I said, if it were intuitively obvious the way the theory claims it is, it wouldn't need the theory.
right. And so what were the kind of critics who were pushing back against you saying? Like, what was their counter argument?
Um, well, it was primarily theologically minded critics who argued that um, the Coleridge's idea of the symbol in nature as a manifestation of God's reason does exist. Example, um, and so they were saying it isn't mystified; it's an accurate description, um, and um, and then others argued that this is simply, a form about that there's this false distinction that he makes between symbol and allegory, and what he calls symbol is really a mystified form of allegory.
Yeah.
And there is some truth to that, but I think the distinction between symbol and allegory was a kind of red herring, which he appropriated from other German writers in order to distinguish what was special about the symbol. And he
Yes.
really doesn't speak about the symbol in literature. It's in Holy Scripture and in nature where he sees it manifested
Right.
primarily.
In which case, some of those may actually be gesturing to something like the divine love of God or something. But in literature, it's much more convoluted.
And even in Scripture, when Coleridge refers to symbols in Scripture, he refers to the meaning of the prophecies
Mm.
in the Hebrew Scriptures, and not to the fact that they're linguistically communicated. So he completely effaces the linguistic dimension, and that itself is telling.
Interesting. I find it so strange how we're using language to deconstruct language. It's just such a strange like phenomenon. I think like using a tool for its own destruction, like the only thing that can only be communicated via language, but is all like it can be communicated via language, but language can never directly gesture to it. You know, I find that really interesting.
Hmm.
Um, yeah. I don't want to keep you for too long today. I want to say thank you so much for speaking with me. I definitely learned so much. My one kind of closing question would be about kind of philosophy and the role in the Romantic period of philosophy. And I was curious what you think about the schools of philosophical thought that were impacting this period and its literature, kind of moving away from Enlightenment thinking, but remnants of that still lingering. How do you think that that was featuring in the Romantic period, and how is it impacting the people living there?
Well, I would begin by contesting this idea that Romanticism represents a kind of rejection of Enlightenment, and I would see um, this as, and that has to do with kind of reified concepts of these two things, Enlightenment and Romanticism. I mean, in fact, many of the supposedly anti-rationalist tendencies that are identified with Romanticism, that Isaiah Berlin and others have identified with Romanticism, are already fully manifested earlier in the 18th century. And in the literature of sensibility, the preoccupation with feeling, and subjectivity, and so on. And and at the same time, there's a preoccupation with reason and so on in the so-called Romantic period as well. So it's not, I don't see them as existing in this kind of tension, although
Mm.
it is useful for various reasons to emphasize such a contrast. Um, I would also say that one of the features that is distinctive of certainly of German Romanticism, British Romanticism to a lesser extent, although Coleridge would be an important figure there, is the the close relationship of philosophy and literature, as we would now call those disciplines. Um, and that is, literature is theorizing itself in very philosophical ways, and that has partly to do with many of the figures we identify with German Romanticism coming out of university settings and having studied philosophy and so on. Um, And it has been argued, and I think very plausibly, that modern literary theory has its origins in this kind of theorizing that occurs in the late 1790s of figures like Friedrich Schlegel and Schelling in his lectures on art, and then later Coleridge, um, and um, and so the the theorizing of literature and the theorizing um, the critique of the possibilities of thought, the epistemological critique, and other kinds of reflection um, are related closely to the literature that's being produced at the time. And so there is this intense relationship that I think is distinctive of that period.
And I think it's definitely a relationship that we do not have anymore today, where philosophy and literature are so intertwined.
Well, they are, and they are. I mean, the academic discipline of philosophy is quite distinct in some, especially analytical philosophy, which is the dominant
Yes.
in the Anglophone world, and is increasingly dominant in other contexts too, surprisingly, perhaps in France and Germany. So that's very different from, whereas philosophy then, as it entered literary theory, as it is widely known and practiced in the Anglophone world, has its origins in, I would say, in Romantic philosophy, but is also now more distant from them, and it doesn't always recognize that kind of genealogy.
Yes, that makes sense. Yes. No, definitely. I like how kind of the symbol ties in with all of everything we've spoken about today, kind of the philosophical schools, the being writing in the Romantic period, the tension between these categories, between Romanticism and Romanticisms. I think the symbol is kind of at the core of what we were just talking about, and I think that that's a really I like the theory that you positioned in the book a lot. So yeah, thank you for that. It was very, very good to read. I don't want to keep you for too long. I'm aware that we've been speaking for almost an hour. So I want to say thank you so much for talking to me. I like really, really enjoyed it. And yeah, I really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.